And I think East Asia is a wonderful illustration of the kinds of changes that have been going on in the world. Let's start with Japan. Japan's modern development dates back to the 1860s. They have a big revolution in 1867. They create a new centralized government in 1868. And they say, by God, we're going to go out and grow and develop and be like those rich Western countries because we want to protect ourselves. We need to have an army to protect ourselves against imperialism. In order to do that, we have to have a modern economy. And then they kind of looked around and said, oh, maybe we can do this too. If the model of the world is imperialism, well, hey, why can't we do that? And they went off doing that. The final straw that impressed upon them the need to control territory in order to prosper was when we cut off the export of oil. I think it was the summer of 1940, because Japan refused to pull its military forces out of China. And the Japanese said, uh-oh, we need oil for our trucks and tanks and ships. Where is the oil? Southeast Asia. Let's go take it. And that basically was the point at which they began the planning that led to the Pacific War. The war, of course, was a huge disaster for them. Imperialism did them no good. At the end of the war, they had several million people dead. All of their major cities had been burned to the ground. They had been attacked with nuclear weapons. The place was a disaster. And out of that disaster, they rebuilt. Not only did they rebuild, prior to World War II, they were kind of a mid-ranking country. They were kind of like Korea today in terms of income levels. After World War II, Japan rises up to become one of that handful of extremely affluent countries at the same level as the European countries at the present time. In doing so, they were unable to exercise military power to resolve problems and disputes or protect themselves or protect the sea lanes and all of this good stuff. They were willing to be 100% dependent on imports of oil, and they have become extremely dependent upon imports of other kinds of basic raw materials, lumber, coal, lead, zinc, copper, even agriculture. We think of Japan as being rather protectionist on agriculture, but over the last 40 years, the share of agricultural products available in the country that were produced domestically has declined from 93% to 60%, and still dropping. It takes a lot for a country that prior to the war had said, we've got to control territory, to open up and say, oh, this is okay. And they've developed a whole series of mechanisms for coping with that dependence upon imports of basic materials. They also are an example of how the new institutions work. Japan is a member, of course, of the WTO, the IMF. In the WTO, we've complained about Japan rather bitterly over much of the last 40 years. Not now, but from the late 1960s through the mid-1990s, we had lots of trade disputes with Japan. But on both sides, our side and the Japanese side, never did we get to the point of saying, screw this, I'm dropping out of the WTO. Right? Because, and particularly for the Japanese, membership and the legitimacy of membership in this organization was very important to them. Furthermore, I think mutual economic gain between the United States and Japan, again, it helps to explain why our disputes over these many years never spun out of control. Then there's China. China, I think, is one of the most amazing stories in Asia. Here we have a country that had this prolonged, painful, devastating revolution, civil war from almost the beginning of the 20th century up until 1949. And along the way, they had to fight the Japanese, too. So finally, in 1949, the communists come into control. They want to radically transform the economic model, which they do. Doesn't work. And it's a very insular model, particularly after they didn't get along too well with the Soviet Union after the early 1960s. And so in the 1980s, they begin to change. They still have their communist government, and we worry about that and don't really know what that means. But economically, this has been phenomenal. For that country to open up to the extent that it has, international trade is now, both exports and imports are more than 30% of GDP. That's like South Korea or the European countries. Not like, United States or Japan. This is a pretty open economy in terms of trade. And on direct investment, they welcomed these capitalist companies to come and invest in their country. So we've now got the inflow of direct investment running at about 8% of fixed capital formation in China. That's pretty high. So I'm just overwhelmed with this. And with it came very high growth, right? We all know that for the last 20 years, 25 years or so, actually coming up in 30 years, China's been growing at an average rate of almost 10% a year. This is like what Japan did from the early 1950s to the mid-1970s. This is a stunning growth rate. As these changes have taken place, this means that China is now deeply embedded with the rest of the world. I have to believe, not being privy to these conversations, but I have to believe that when the political leadership in China sits down and has a debate over what are we going to do about the latest provocation from Taiwan, right? You got the president of Taiwan says, we want to be in a legitimate independent country, which is the one thing that none of us will let them say. You have to believe that some people in that discussion and the upper reaches of the political leadership say, well, if we actually attack Taiwan, it's going to really screw up our economic relationship with the United States and Japan and Europe. And you know what? That's going to cause the economy to go into recession. And if the people aren't feeling good, they're not going to feel real good about the political leadership. And so I think it's become at least a factor, right? I'm not saying they're not going to attack Taiwan. That one can imagine scenarios in which that would happen. But I think it's become a fairly important factor in those deliberations.